Good morning and welcome to the August 29th, 2019 Utah Division of Drinking Water webinar. Hopefully you've stuck with us while we've been working through this. We had a massive shift in how Google was running their YouTube software that we were using, and it's basically been about 24 hours of pure fury trying to figure out how exactly that was going to go. But good, sound's working when there's that back sound. Okay, glad to know that that's working. Thank you for joining us. Today we are going to have Jared Mendenhall. He is what's your job title?
I'm one of the public information officers here at the Department of Environmental Quality.
Yep, he's one of our public information officers. He just said that very well, which is good because it's necessary for his job to speak the words correctly. And he's been exceedingly patient with this morning's webinar problems. Let's get into some reminders really quickly. It is still lead and copper sampling season. If you are a system that is on reduced monitoring and looking to do those summer samples, those are coming due. Please be checking WaterLink and make sure that if you've taken those samples, that you've gotten them to us and that we have results. Lead and copper is one of the hardest samples to correct once you have that violation issued, because you have to wait until the proper sampling season to take the necessary samples. If you need technical assistance, please reach out to Luke Treidel in our office or Rachel Cassidy and find out what we can do to help you to make sure that you understand how the lead and copper process works. You can also check last month's webinar that went over lead and copper sampling and lead and copper certification. It's also DBP sampling season. Disinfection byproducts are up and running. It's that hot time of the year, so all those samples that are due over a period of time that need the summer window to get the best sample results are due. Check with Randy Ryan in our office if you have questions on DBP sampling. Check WaterLink if you've taken those samples and gotten them to us to make sure that we have them. Double check that. IPS 2020 is moving forward. We had the most recent board meeting this week. The tables were approved, which is the next step in the rulemaking process for IPS 2020. And it looks like that is still on schedule to meet our implementation schedule that we've set forth in the previous trainings. If you don't know what IPS 2020 is, please go back and watch any of the number of IPS 2020 webinars that we've done. Reach out to talk to division staff and get a copy of your IPS 2020 IPS 2020 report. Talk to Jennifer Yee in our office. She's the IPS rule manager. Talk to Rachel Cassidy. You can talk to me. We're all in the rules section fairly well versed on how this is going to impact water systems. But if not, please let us know if you need help. Upcoming trainings. If you can see right there, if you're anywhere near Logan City or willing to drive from one end of the state to the other, on September 17th, there is an IPS 2020 training. Division staff will be there all day. In the morning, we'll start with a heavy training session, PowerPoints going over all the aspects of IPS 2020, and then in the afternoon, there will be one more training session and then a workshop where water systems can sit down with division staff and look over the IPS 2020 report for their system and see if there's things that we need to do or how that's going to impact your water system. I conducted one of these trainings last month in Cedar City. Thank you to all of you who were there. And it was really interesting because a number of systems are like, well, I'm fine now. I'm good. I don't need to stick around for the afternoon. I know everything's fine. I gave the filing, said, just stick around, do it. That's what you're going to need for the CEUs. Come back for the training session. And you can't hear me? I heard me on here.
Okay, hold on.
Come back for the training session in the afternoon, and a number of systems found issues that they didn't know that they had. They thought everything was fine, and there was a couple of things, but we were able to work through a lot of them, resolve a number of issues, get the technical assistance that we like to provide to prevent that. So please take advantage of that Logan training if you're anywhere near Logan City or can make the drive. September 10th through the 12th, there's a cross-connection control administration training in Midway, Utah. This is, if you checked Gary Rager's webinar that he did on the changes to the cross-connection control program, then you will see that is, you can see those changes there. Why is that kicking over? Okay, all right, I'm getting the thumbs up. Ms. T can't hear me now. All right. The September 10th through the 12th, the Cross Connection Control Administration in Midway is to help water systems become compliant with the changes to the Cross Connection Control Program that we've had. If you have questions on that, contact Gary Rager in our office. Watch the webinar first before you call Gary. I sit right next to him, so your phone calls can be loud and I have to focus. So watch that webinar first. That's a joke. Call him whenever you need to. September 26th through the 27th is the Water Conservation Certification Program administered by the Utah Rural Water System. Both. Yeah. Administered by the Water Conservation Certification Program in Salt Lake City. I believe that's at the DNR building, but you will need to check Rural Water's website for locations and times for all of these trainings and how those will play out. The American Waterworks Association has a September 19th Small Systems Workshop in St. George. This is a compliance-based workshop training. They've partnered, I believe, with RCAC. We've worked with them on the curriculum for this. These are incredibly valuable trainings. It's a free system for free training for water systems in St. George. And on that same day, if you're on the northern end of the state near Woods Cross, there's a similar small systems training. So take a look at those options. And with that, we will move over to Jared Mendenhall, our public affairs during emergency responses. This is funny. We actually have our emergency response work group meeting right now during our webinar here in the division with all of our partner agencies.
Clearly they don't need this information.
Yeah. So and a lot of that work group was put together. I don't know how many people know this. That work group was put together by our former director Ken Bousfield so that we had consensus across, so local health departments and DEQ would have some similar talking points and some similar, like, this is what we're saying, and that there wasn't sort of a confusion of us saying the boil order is lifted and the health department saying it's not, or vice versa. And so that's some things that have come out of that, and that's a continued work group that's still going on. So.
And of course, that's an important part, and we'll get into that a little further as we talk this morning about the importance of consistent messages. But what I wanted to say is that, thank you for being here today. I'm excited to have an opportunity to speak with you a little bit about how we do public affairs during emergency responses. So let's start out. We want to talk about what is public affairs. Public affairs is the way, the fancy word that government agencies talk about public relations. And the idea behind this, government agencies were some of the first organizations to actually engage in public relations. There is a vital stakeholder that is the taxpayers that are engaged in what we're doing here as government agencies. And so when we're talking about public affairs, we're actually talking about public relations. And when we're talking about public relations, we're talking about how an organization communicates to the public. This is generally through the media. I mean, traditionally that was send out a press release, meet with a newspaper reporter, and then TV came along, and radio, and now we have social media. We have a bunch of different mediums that messages get out to people. And so what we're talking about here is the most effective techniques and ways to communicate with your stakeholders and the public, especially when you end up with an emergency. Okay? So crises are going to happen. Here's just a quick look at a couple of bullet points about what public affairs are. So this is government relations, media communications, issue management, information dissemination, and then that weird one there at the end, strategic communications. So what we're talking about is all of this today, and at the end, how can we be more strategic so that we're more effective? So that when an issue comes up, boil order, or something worse, there's going to be a lot of stress. The body, the mind, they're going to be jumping into that fight or flight situation. What is a way that we can bring us back down, calm ourselves down, have a plan going forward so that we can effectively do this? In our business, especially in drinking water, what we're dealing with is human health, right? Whenever there's a crisis in drinking water, there is a potential that people are going to get sick. And so what we're trying to do here is mitigate those effects, preserve the reputation of the drinking water operators, and ultimately protect human health. And that's our mission here at DEQ.
And that's really important, especially when we're on a...
Because we're not seeing the same things you guys are seeing. The only thing we're seeing is the initial screen that says, the first slide that says your name, and that's all we are seeing. I confirmed with Rachel because she's watching it.
Great.
Okay, so we're having some quick technical difficulties. But
We may just keep talking, and you might just not see the slides, because it may be the first. This might not be the worst division webinar. It might be the best podcast we've ever done.
Yes. So, FYI, we can't. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks for the note.
Okay.
I like that the audio's working though. So.
We're gonna talk through this.
Yeah.
And Colt's gonna jump in here with some questions when he has them. We are not going to have any visuals, so just take a quick look at this great picture of the water. But take notes, and we can share the PowerPoint. There isn't a ton to it. We're just going to basically be going over what we're talking about right now. So every organization is vulnerable to a crisis, and a crisis is anything that's going to threaten or harm people or property or seriously damage your reputation or negatively impact your organization. And so what we're talking about is the most effective way of going about and dealing with this. So
what I was going to say before I found out that we have no visuals is that it's really complicated in the water industry because we speak in terms that the public doesn't understand. I start off most of my presentations to water operators even with a list of all the alphabet soup acronyms that we speak in. We had a former employee who came to us from the military who said that we put the DoD and the military to shame in our use of acronyms and communicating that. And then it becomes even more important when we're talking about science. I don't know if you're going to cover this later, but we have, when we're talking about parts per million, parts per billion, not everybody knows what that means. Not everybody has a water background or a science background enough to understand. They hear 33 parts per million of X contaminant, and it's terrifying because they don't understand what that actually means. I think that kind of falls into that strategic communication.
And we're certainly going to get into that. We're not going to get into as much the tactics. Hopefully, when you gather your crisis communication team together, you're going to be able to spend some time with those tactics. The hope, of course, is that you're going to bring in a subject matter expert that is going to be able to spot when you're using jargon, that is going to be able to craft the messages that you're pulling together, and we'll get into that as we go on. They're going to be able to craft that message so that you aren't coming out there standing up in front of a camera or shooting out a message where you're communicating in a bunch of jargon, in a bunch of scientific terms, and that audience, those stakeholders, have no idea what you're speaking about. And the thing that we want to do is we want to communicate to the people that need to be communicated to in a way that doesn't create a greater public health issue. And so there are going to be public health issues. There are going to be times where you need to shut down the water and bring in bottled water. Mm-hmm. Hopefully, most of us can get through our career where that's not a regular event. But what we don't want to do in those situations is increase the problem by having a lousy communication plan, by not being proactive in these situations where you create an additional public health problem or an additional public crisis by not being prepared, by not taking the effective steps to address this. So we're going to jump into that right now. So the one thing we want to look at is that we're going to jump into 10 steps of crisis communication. These were created by a guy named Jonathan Bernstein, and he runs a crisis communications firm called Bernstein Crisis Communication. So if you get on the web and you go, hey, wait a second, I saw these. This isn't original content, but we're going to go over it. These are the best practices. This is what they would teach you if you were going to school for public affairs or public relations. So Experience demonstrates that organizational leadership often doesn't understand that in the absence of adequate internal and external communication, a few things will happen. We're going to go over those few things. The things that are going to happen is you're going to have operational response is going to break down. Your stakeholders will not know what's happening and quickly become confused, angry, and react negatively to what's going on. Third thing is that the organization will be perceived as inept at best, and in certain cases, we can be criminally negligent. So we want to avoid that, of course. Fourth, the length of time required to bring full resolution to an issue will be expanded, and often dramatically. So something that could have been resolved in a few days by having adequate proactive communication is going to drag on for weeks and months and years. So this is what we're trying to avoid by taking some of these steps right now. And we're going to break it down into pre-crisis and post-crisis steps that you can take to ensure that when something happens, none of us are operating on the idea that anything bad is ever going to happen. We're all taking steps. But occasionally, something's going to happen, right? And we have to deal with that. And then lastly, the impact to the financial and the reputational bottom line of your organization is going to be damaged. Okay, so those are the things that we're trying to avoid here. The basic steps of effective communications in a crisis are not difficult, but they require some advanced work, they require some organization, and they require some collaboration, especially in the drinking water realm. So here we're going to jump into these. The first thing you want to do is you want to anticipate the crisis. That's the first step you want to do. So our recommendation is that you gather a crisis communications team, and that's going to look a little differently depending on what organization you're involved in. Okay, so my guess, you're a small drinking water operator. You don't have a social media team and a public relations team, and you don't have these things. That doesn't mean that those resources aren't available to you. So the thing that you need to start thinking about is who is going to be on your crisis communications team, right? You're definitely going to want to have somebody involved in that team that is in upper management that can make decisions and can initiate this. What you don't want to do is spend a lot of time with a bunch of people that are going to bring back recommendations that management isn't going to be behind. Right? Management didn't buy off on. There's not going to be any momentum to execute on any of these, and that of course is going to be a waste of time. Let's not waste everybody's time. So the first person you need to bring in is you need to bring in somebody that has some decision making, a decision making position. So you're going to need to bring in somebody from upper management. In certain cases, you may want to have legal counsel involved in this decision. That can be expensive. Not everybody has that available, but you need to consider what resources you have. But you do want somebody that can give it some perspective on, okay, we're dealing with a crisis here. What are that has an understanding of what the legal ramifications are, what the legal responsibilities of the response are, so that you can bring that in. And then lastly, you're going to want to bring in somebody with some public relations, public affairs, understanding, and acumen. Now, again, you're a small water operator in a rural area, that may not be available to you, but then you got to start looking around and reaching out to those people. Obviously, in a crisis, the Division of Drinking Water is going to be involved. The local health department is going to be involved. Those are two obvious people that probably need to be brought in, and in most cases, they do have some of that public relation. They have a public relations team or a public relations person on hand that are going to want to be involved in some of this. Yeah. The issue that we're coming here is you're going to want to gather this team up together. You're going to want to be transparent. Here is, and what you're going to want to do is you identify, and that's the second step, is identify your crisis communications team. What you're gathering this team up to do is to build a vulnerability audit. And a vulnerability audit is that you're basically going to gather this team together and you're going to brainstorm the worst case scenarios. You're going to say, okay, what crises could we potentially face in the future? And how are we going to deal with those? So the first time you do this exercise, you need to probably buy lunch and plan on everybody being there for a day as you just kind of work through this process. And what you want to do is build this list of here are the potential crises that our organization could face. And then once you've kind of gone through that, then you're going to want to start figuring out how you're going to deal with that. So the second step is identify your crisis communications team, and we kind of jumped in between those two. And they're going to come up and head this up, and we've talked about as much as we need to talk about on who you want to bring into this crisis communication team. There isn't a hard, fast rule of who needs to be involved in this, right? But so you're going to want to bring in maybe heads of other divisions or departments in your organization that are going to have some perspective. You may want to bring in subject matter experts that understand some of the issues that you're...
Yeah.
And what you want to come away with is a custom plan that's an exact fit to your organization. When this happens, we are going to do this. When this happens, this is how we're going to respond. And you want people on there that, one, can make decisions and can execute it. You don't want to have, well, we gathered up some of these guys over here. They came up with a bunch of ideas. We hate the ideas. We're not going to really execute on it. You're not going to be prepared when this crisis happens. Again, the first time you do this, most people don't have this in their back pocket. They haven't created this file. The first time you do it, it is going to take a little bit of effort. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's going to take picking up the phone, sending some emails, having a conversation, bringing in people like local health departments, Division of Drinking Water, things like that, so that you are prepared. The good news is once you kind of get some momentum on this, and then you're updating it every 6 months, every year, then you have some momentum behind it. We'll get into that in later steps. You're not going to have to put as much effort into it once you get this established. So once you've anticipated the crises, you've built this vulnerability audit, and you've identified who you want on your team and how you want to deal with it, the next thing you want to do is identify and train a spokesperson. Okay, so during a crisis, there are going to be times when you need somebody who is going to be out in front, who's going to be talking to the media. You don't want somebody to show up with a camera and a guy that's operating a backhoe give the statement for your organization. Now, the guy operating the backhoe may also be your organization's spokesperson, but you don't want that to be random. You want this person to have been selected, and you want this person to be trained and prepared for what's going to happen. So here's a few things that happen that you want to look for in this spokesperson. You want to make sure that they have the right skills, they have the right position in the company. It doesn't always mean that it's the executive. Certain crises will require that the person at the top of the food chain is the one out in front speaking. Other times it may not. It may just need to be somebody who is good on camera and able to communicate these things effectively. But you have to also understand that there are certain times that the public is not going to accept a statement from the quote-unquote designated spokesperson. They want to hear from the guy in charge or the person in charge. So in the right skills, here's the thing that you have to also consider. Oftentimes your senior level executive, your senior level management, they're wonderful leaders. They can inspire people. They can really direct the company or the organization. When they get a camera in front of them, they fall apart. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to do it. So just because you have the top position and just because you're a charismatic leader doesn't mean you are the person that needs to be on camera. Okay, so you need to assess that. People need to be really honest, put egos aside, and figure out who is the best person and the most credible person to put up in front to make these statements. And so that might be water operator XYZ is always going to lean on local health department ABC, and they're going to use their resources for addressing these sorts of things. It might be something like that. This is the part where getting that team together and walking through this and talking through how you're going to do this is going to enable you to be prepared so that you're not it's not falling apart in the heat
moment,
of the moment.
It's also for a lot of the small systems that are community systems that are dealing with elected officials. This is the type of thing that if you get the opportunity to sit down with them, you may want to brief them, your council, your mayor, so that they know that when this is happening, explain to them and bring them into this early on. Like it's bring in your mayors, bring in your city councilmen. If you're trying to develop a strategy for when this happens, you want them to understand how this is going to play out so that they're not all clamoring and that they're on the same team in the middle of an emergency. And that's not necessarily your job, but if you're the water operator, it's the type of thing that you're taking this on to develop these talking points. Make sure you're involving those people in charge and those elected officials.
That's a perfect point. So here is a common thing that you've all seen this happen. There's a crisis. One group starts throwing the other group under the bus. There isn't a unified front. There isn't a unified communication. One group doesn't know what the other group is saying, so they're coming out and saying, this is what's happening. No, this is what's happening. And here's where what we described in the earlier part, here's where it starts to fall apart. Here's where an issue that we could have resolved over a weekend, everything was taken care of, ends up being a situation where either lawyers are involved, you're still fighting this battle 6 months after it happened. It wasn't resolved clearly. It wasn't resolved quickly. Usually this is a situation where, and rightly so, a private organization like a privately owned water organization may not want to be, they may have a little bit of hesitation of bringing in these government organizations. They don't want the health department coming in and hearing the inner workings.
Right.
You need to have a long, hard talk about that and consider what is the best for your organization going forward. Because transparency, the key number one mistake that people do when going into a crisis is they either become an ostrich and stick their head in the sand and be like, well, this is going to blow over. They try to hide things, and they become reactive instead of proactive in these situations. So what you want to do is have that long, hard conversation within your organization, make the hard choices, figure out who needs to be brought in, bring them in, because it isn't a situation of if you're going to have a problem. Okay, you're all water operators. You know how the system works. Okay, there's going to be breakdowns. There are going to be problems. There are going to be issues. How quickly you can respond to that is going to dictate how much pain you feel, right? It's not that you're going to have a perfectly run water system all the time. How you react to the situations when it isn't being perfectly operated is going to determine how much pain you feel later on.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's an ongoing process too. Like elections happen, personnel changes. If we're seeing one of the big issues we're facing now is we're having a wave of retirements among operators who take all that institutional knowledge with them, and this is the type of thing you need to be talking about with new hires. If you're starting people who are just starting their career in the water industry, this is part of that succession planning. Share the experiences you've had in the past with your new hires and talk about when we had this line break, what went wrong, because they do not know that on day one. And it's a lot easier to hear the story and be like, I don't want to do this, than to learn that the hard way. I mean, that's a really good thing that I think that we forget a lot, is some of those nuanced things that aren't in the job description. I mean, you're hired to run the water system, to turn the valves, to take the samples, to keep the water flowing. But it's all that peripheral stuff that comes with that institutional systems or institutional knowledge that leaves when a water operator retires after running a system for 30 years. So try and tell those stories and be very honest about where you screwed up and how you do it differently, and help that new operator take over so they don't have to experience the same pain firsthand.
So as we're identifying and training that spokesperson, the things you need to remember is your executive may be a brilliant organizational leader. They may not be very effective as an in-person communicator or a communicator with the media. You also want to remember that just because you have really good written communication doesn't mean that your spokesperson is going to be any good on camera. You also, the last thing that we need to point out in identifying this spokesperson is that the skill set is varied. This isn't just about getting on camera. This isn't just about writing a press release. You also need to understand, what is the social media message going to be? How are you using social media? On a side note, you need to start thinking about what your social media presence is, because we do live in a world where I hear something, I hear a rumor, the first thing I do is, what's their Facebook page saying? What's their Twitter feed saying? And if they show up on your Facebook page that you built after one of these webinars 5 years ago, and the last post was from 4 years ago, there's a big credibility gap there. And what you don't want to come off in a situation is that we're inept. We're a bunch of jokesters that have just been passing around memes. You want a credible communication line there to residents. And it will increase your credibility, your value, and the effectiveness of your organization.
I also have one of the big things on social media is is if you have that Facebook or that Twitter, and you brought this up, is that people expect responses.
Yes.
Like I initially signed up for Twitter because I wanted to be able to get customer service from airlines, or I was having a hard time getting my flight rebooked once, and I tweeted at the airline and got a response much faster than calling the customer service line, because they recognized that was public, that other people could see that I was saying, hey, airline, what's going on? Why aren't you helping me rebook? And it became very apparent to everybody who was viewing my Twitter feed that I was not getting a response from the airline. And the same thing's true if your system has that. I'm not telling you to do it or not, but if it's there, and if it was my water system, that might be something and I wasn't getting the answers, I would absolutely tweet to my water system and say, why don't I have water? Why am I on a boil order? What happened? What is the breakdown? And I would expect a response.
And on social media, it's better to own the channel that you're using and be actively engaged in it than to be on every platform. So it's better to have a strong Facebook presence and no Twitter, no Instagram, no anything else, than to have everything plus Snapchat, plus TikTok, plus whatever other thing is the hot new moment, where you're on every single platform and there's a tendency to go and sign up and have every platform and you're not engaged, you're not doing anything on it. That hurts your credibility. It's better to just have the Facebook page or just have the Twitter feed. If that's all you had the bandwidth to deal with, then it's better to do one thing good than to do a lot of things bad.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So we've gathered a team together. We've done a vulnerability audit. We've identified who our spokesperson is. The next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that spokesperson has the proper training, right? And now this is where we kind of come into those situations where you put the executive out and the top management guy, and he has an hour-long conversation with a news reporter, and the news reporter didn't use his best stuff, right? So that's because he was good. He was dancing for the reporter. He was talking. He was charming the reporter. He was doing all of that. But in the end, his message wasn't clear. So at this point, here's where you're starting to need that important part of you want to make sure that they're trained, that they're able to get out and effectively talk to the media. Mm-hmm. Number 5, we'll go over this quickly, is you want to establish notification and monitoring systems. Okay, so this is going to be set up the Google Alerts. With Hootsuite, these are free. So you can pay for this service. But free services are going to be like Hootsuite and Google Alerts, where you're going to want to be able to see what is being said and what's being said on social media, what's being said in the media, so that you have an idea of what your stakeholders and what your public are perceiving, how they're talking about the situation, and then you're going to have the opportunity to address some of those things. Again, back to transparent and proactive. I mean, those are key philosophical things that you need to have in mind as you're dealing with this stuff. As you try to cover up, hide from, just react to a situation, that's where you're going to end up in trouble. Okay, you want to be out in front of the story. You want to be proactive. It doesn't feel good to stand up in front of everybody and say, hey man, we messed up. It doesn't feel good. But the quicker you can come to terms with that, accept that, and deal with that, the easier the situation's going to be. Again, the times when you get into trouble, people can forgive you for an honest mistake. Yeah. The thing where they're going to have a hard time and it's going to keep coming back around and you have just wrecked the next year of your life is when you stuck your head in the sand, and when you tried to minimize the problem, and when you tried to keep away, you tried to get out of that awful 5 minutes where you had to stand up in front of everybody and say, we screwed up.
Right.
And here's what we're going to do to fix this problem. Okay? Doesn't feel good. It's going to take 10, 15 minutes. It's going to be a bad night, but it's going to save you pain, lots and lots of pain in the future. There's plenty of examples of this. You've seen this happen. You've seen this happen in the community of water operators. Bury your head in the sand, minimize the problem, avoid taking responsibility, and you are going to have a miserable coming year.
Yeah.
Okay? Best case scenario, you're going to have a miserable coming year. Worst case scenario, you're looking for another job, and everybody thinks you're a doofus and they don't want to hire you. Okay? So this is the stuff that we want to be on top of. This is why you want to establish that notification and monitoring system. This is step 5, where you are seeing what's being said. Okay? Because you have an idea. We went out in front of the newspaper reporter and we gave them our message that was coordinated with the local health department and the local government, and we're good. And then you find out on social media, it's not, the message didn't get received a certain way. There was stuff you didn't think about. There were issues that are coming up, and there is a backlash going on, and that stuff can really get out of control. Rumors can start flying. You need to be on top of that. You need to know what people are being said. And again, communication has changed. There was a time where it just went out in the newspaper, and 2 people drinking coffee in the morning were reading the newspaper, and they were like, rah, 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 and it didn't have that viral effect. But you can have a situation where somebody's posting something on social media, or somebody wrote something, or a blog. All of a sudden, you have a bunch of people they're getting engaged in that, and it can get out of control. So that's where we're not going to spend a ton of time on that. But you want to establish some sort of monitoring and notification.
And I think we've all seen that, maybe not with water, but we've definitely seen that happen on other things. And there's social media like Nextdoor, where all of your neighbors are right there. And if there's a water issue in that neighborhood, that app goes crazy. And my neighbors know that I'm the water guy, and I get inundated with calls. We've never actually had one, but even like the CCR came out, and they didn't understand that. I get calls.
Yeah. So
and redirect them to
you want to be to that.
But yeah,
the next step, and this is all sort of happening in that first initial months of you coming up with this crisis communications plan. We're running through these steps. The 6th step is you want to identify and know who your stakeholders are.
Yeah.
Part of one of the things that people get tempted and is it isn't you don't necessarily need to send out a press release for every issue that's coming up. There are going to be certain issues where you need to make a big wide notification because it's just too impossible. Sometimes it is what your legal response is, and the best way to do it is we need to hand this flyer out to all these doors within this hour, right? And who's going to do that? How's that going to go? So you need to identify who are these stakeholders, and those stakeholders are, the first one's going to be obvious, the people buying water from you. It gets a little less obvious as you start moving down the line, but these are stakeholders. The Division of Drinking Water, those are good people to have inform of situations.
Because you're required to by regulation. Beyond that, we also have a lot of technical expertise here. We've dealt with every water emergency in this state has come through our office at one point or another.
Eventually, right?
Eventually.
But
we've dealt with them all, so we have some experience here with these. We've probably seen something like it before, and if we haven't, we have a bigger network beyond Utah. When we've had issues that we've never seen, we reach out to every other regulatory agency in the country and be like, what did you do and how did you do this? I mean, we do have a lot of expertise here. So beyond just you're required to let us know, we are here to help. So
this is what you're doing when you're trying to identify those stakeholders. It isn't just the people who buy water from you. There's regulatory agencies, there's local health departments, there's local government, there's also internal audiences. Don't underestimate how rumors are being started and spread by your own employees. That doesn't mean they're bad people. Human beings like to talk about things. They like to talk about things that are emotionally charged. They like to go home after work and say, this is the crazy messed up thing that happened to me today. You won't believe what Mr. So-and-so did or Mrs. So-and-so did. They do that. That isn't that they're bad employees. That isn't that they're disloyal employees. Human beings like to talk about emotionally charged things. So you have an internal audience with your employees that you need to think about how you are communicating what is going on with them. Just because they're involved in whatever operation, don't think that they're on the same page with you. Don't think that they completely understand what's going on just because you do.
Yeah.
You want to make sure that there are ways, especially in a crisis, that you are communicating with them. And again, falls on the side of transparency, right? The idea that sending out an email saying, we had this crisis, don't talk to anybody about it, that doesn't work.
No.
You need to sit down and say, here's what's happening, here's what we're doing. You need to be transparent with them. They already know what's going on. So if you think that you're hiding something from your employees, you're delusional.
Yeah.
Your employees know what's going on. Often, they may even know more about what's going on than the management. Okay.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that you have that channel of communication open and that you are communicating to those. So, step number 6, you want to identify and know who your stakeholders are. You want to have some rough idea who's getting what message in this process, and you want to make sure that you're not lazy about that. Okay, there's the people who are buying water from us. There's the regulatory agencies. There's the local government, local health department. There's also internal channels that need to be communicated to.
If you're selling water to anybody, that's a big one. If you're a water system that has a consecutive connection that you're wheeling water down, and that's going to impact them, 1, you are required to let them know, but 2, make sure you have an inventory of who you need to call at that consecutive connection, and that you record how you let them know.
And although they may not be on your communication, your crisis communication team, the people you are wheeling water down to, you probably at some point need to bring them in and say, here's our crisis communication.
Yeah.
Here are the things that we think will affect you. This is how we would like to communicate. Would you kindly think through some of these issues? So that the other thing in an issue where you're having a crisis, you want everybody on the same page. We talked about those problems where you run into one organization is throwing the other organization under the bus. One organization is saying one thing, one organization is saying another thing. When we're talking about human public health concerns, those inconsistencies freak people out.
Yes.
They magnify the problem. So you don't necessarily need to have them come in and do all the situations, but there is going to be a point where we perceive that these problems are going to happen with people that are down, that we're wheeling water down to. You need to bring them in and say, open it up, here's our crisis communication plan, here are the things that we're going to be doing. This is the person we're going to be using as a spokesperson, these are the holding statements that we put together, this is how we're going to address this. So that on the off chance that any of this happens, everybody just comes together, there's a plan, you have a united front, you're moving forward. And again, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to take 15 minutes of pain up front to avoid multiple years of pain down the line.
And beyond that, it's vital that they get the right information so they don't get sick. Like you really, we're talking about the pain we're trying to save from ourselves, but at the end of the day, people need to know how long to boil their water if they're on a boil order. And they're going to want to know what happened, and they're going to want to have confidence in you. Use that. You can use an emergency, and I've seen it done with water systems where they communicate it effectively, and their citizens turn around and give that water system kudos all over the place on their Facebook page. I've seen them say, hey, thanks for handling this. I felt very I have seen that, and I've seen the opposite. And you can build a lot of confidence with your customers in an emergency if you do it right.
Again, everybody can forgive an honest mistake. Yeah. If you stand up, you take responsibility and do everything in your power to ensure that it's handled appropriately.
Right.
What they won't forgive is when you minimized it, when you stuck your head in the sand, when you just did a bad job of talking to them about it.
Yeah.
None of us want that initial pain of having to deal with all of this. But you have to have that mentality of we're gonna take this hit right now, so that we don't spend the next year of our life in a miserable situation
Right.
because we thought that informing an extra 100 residents of the boil order or whatever the situation may be is too painful.
Right.
What you want to do is have an appropriate reaction, but you don't want to minimize. You don't want to stick your head in the sand. You don't want to hope that it blows over, because it won't.
Yeah.
So we're identifying our stakeholders. Now we get into the part where, and again, this is all before the crisis happens, where you want to develop holding statements. And holding statements are, now this isn't your full message development. That usually waits when you have the crisis actually break out. Holding statements are messages designed for use immediately after a crisis breaks. And these can be developed in advance, and they can be used in a wide variety of scenarios on social media or as talking points in a press conference or something like that. So you want to prepare, okay, what are the key messages that we want to get out to people in this scenario, in this scenario, in this scenario. This doesn't need to be like we've written the full press release, but you want to have those messages.
Yeah.
So there was an incident a couple weeks ago. We needed to jump in and help a water system prepare a press release on E. coli contamination. It felt really overwhelming at the time, but those messages had already been cultivated. So there was some little tweaks that we had to do to get the press release ready, but we're essentially cutting and pasting things in there because we already know what the language needs to be. We already know what legally the language needs to be. It's gathered in one spot, so we're not running around going, where's that paragraph on this? And we can get that out quickly. And we already know that it's been vetted. We already know that we're covered. We've carried the important information that needs to be carried on. We've done that pre-work. So the last step in pre-crisis, after we've gone through all these steps, is then you want to start developing those holding statements.
Yeah.
You want that communications team to get together. Okay, what do we legally have to communicate? What needs to be in there? And you're ready to go. You don't want to be trying to figure this out and trying to find these pieces of information and trying to find this verbiage when it's all falling apart around you.
When you're also trying to fix the problem.
Yeah.
And a lot of these water systems, they're a one-person show. You know, it's the water operator who's also the wastewater operator, who's running the cemetery, the dog catcher, and everything in between. And you may be called upon to fix this as part of your job.
Yeah.
And having that prepped and ready to go
And so
is
having
going to
also
make you look.
having had the communications team already come through and working, you know who the spokesperson is going to be, you know what's going to be said, they're trained, they're ready to go. There's a quick meeting where you pick out the specifics and you define the specifics on the issue, and then bam, you're ready to execute on this thing. And there isn't a situation where somebody's like, well, this has been going on since Wednesday, because everybody, when you discovered it, everybody was on vacation or in bed or whatever the excuse is, and they're just excuses, but you are ready to go. And that's why you're doing this pre-work. And you're spending a minute getting ready so that when it happens, you're like, we're looking up the E. coli file. There's the statements on E. coli. We're pulling the press release together. We got the guy, the spokesperson. Here's your talking points. They're ready to go. We're ready to go. It also takes the temperature in the room down.
Yeah.
You already have a good idea what's going to go on. Oh, we can put this on the social media. We know where the social media channels are. We know where the passwords are. We're ready to go. And it takes the temperature down in the room. You can start focusing on your core responsibility of fixing the problem. And you're not sitting there trying to find a phone number of some dude who's going to be the guy who takes care of this problem for you. You're proactive. You're not hiding. You're transparent. You're moving forward. And again, the benefit to you is you're gonna do a little bit of pain in getting this all prepared and a little bit of organization. It seems ridiculous because really, are we ever gonna have this problem? So that when the situation comes together, you are ready to go, and it saves you a ton of pain down the line. Okay. Colt, do you have any questions so far?
So far, I think we are hitting it on all cylinders.
We're about done. We got 2 more points, and we can be done. Post-crisis, you're not done after all of this. You need to assess the crisis situation after after the situation. This seems really apparent. You need to gather that crisis team together again. You need to have a postmortem. Okay, what did we do that was good? Where did we mess up? How's this situation going? How are we going to revise this crisis communication plan that we've devised, a year or 2 years earlier, so that we don't run into the issues that we ran into in the last one, right? So hopefully it was all smooth and you're like, that worked like clockwork, but you still want to get together and assess the situation and tweak things in the plan, okay? So then number 9 is you want to finalize and adapt the key messages. So you're going to learn something from every situation you go into, and you're going to say, oh, here was an issue that we had with this, here's where we had a problem, this is where it didn't work very well. This could apply to these 4 other scenarios that we've identified as potential problems. Let's go in and do this. Oh, we forgot to include the people that we will water down to. We need to go and have that conversation now. Or whatever the situation is where it becomes more aware that, we never had that conversation with the city council. We talked to the mayor, but the mayor and the city council hate each other, so he didn't pass anything on. So we need to reach out to them so that we make sure that, that this is the part where you start taking a look at that. You want to adapt your messages so that they effectively address stuff.
How important is it in that debrief to make sure that everybody feels safe to say what went wrong, both for themselves and for everyone in the room, without making it and that you're the one who screwed up? Like, I know I've been through some of these and it's not comfortable.
Yeah.
But and sometimes it's your boss who you want to be like, you really should have done this, and you can't always do that.
Yeah.
But if you can establish that, it is an amazing how cathartic that is for everybody, as well as bringing a team together.
Yeah. So one of my mentors was really key on saying, when you're having these conversations, you just need everybody's ego has to be put out of the side. There's going to be some people that are better office place communicators. They're better at not making it personal and just saying, here's the issues that I saw, here's the issues that I saw. Of course, now we're getting into your organizational communication and your organizational effectiveness. And
that's something we can't fix or solve or change in a webinar.
We can't fix that you hate each other.
Yeah.
But yeah, in order to make these things as effective as possible, you do need to be able to have really good communication with the other people on the team. And maybe that's what you think about when you're pulling that team together.
Yeah.
Actually, these 2 people hate each other. And although it makes sense for them to both be on the team, maybe we got to figure out a workaround around on that. I mean, this is just, you have to think through these things. Because it does need to be an open situation where you're like, the point of the debrief is that you take that long, hard look in the mirror, right? Our natural tendency as human beings is to come up with a story, a version of events that makes us the hero of our life. That doesn't necessarily lead to more effectiveness. Right. Taking that long, hard look in the mirror and realizing, I was wrong there. My ego got in the way. My priorities got in the way of doing the right thing. Hard to do, but that's where you're going to become more effective in how you put these things together.
100%.
Best of luck in coming up with a perfect scenario on that. Like, best of luck. But yeah,
I've seen them go very right and very, very wrong.
Yeah, but I do agree with Colt in both preparing this and then doing the debrief. You're going to want to put some egos, check those egos, check the emotional baggage at the door, and really just come together for this is our mission, this is our objective. We're going to try and do this as the most effective and clearest way that we can. And then lastly, you're going to want to do a post-crisis analysis, and that's basically where you update the crisis communications plan and you update the crisis communication team so that you're more effective the next time that comes along. And that's what I got for you.
It's great.
Colt, do you have any quick questions that you want to get to? I know that we're right there at the end of our
We are right
hour
there.
long.
I mean, we've got we had some tech difficulties, so how much actual content we got, probably a little bit less. But the big thing I do want to stress is that crisis communication is different than meeting public notification requirements in rule. Public notification, we have very strict, like this is how you do this is how you don't. There is required language, and a lot of that is veered around who is the most vulnerable person in your water system. That's usually the elderly or it's children. And so we are always operating under who is most likely to get sick. Reach out to us, work with us. A lot of this work on how to do this, we've done a lot of it. If this is something you want us to get some copies of resources and you want copies of those public notification forms on how to do a boil order, we've done that. We have, like that emergency response group I was talking about earlier, prepared documents. It was a large stakeholder group of water systems, local health departments. And so a lot of this is available. I know we threw a lot at you today without any visuals, but a lot of this has been done, and this,
Again, in most cases, if you raise your hand and say, I need some help, you'll realize that you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Absolutely.
So when we're coming into this and I'm like, here's the 10 steps, and you got to get a team together, and you got to do this, and you need to get a file to get... You do not need to turn yourself into a public relations professional in this situation. The resources are available to you. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There is some organization and some thought that you do need to do around this, but the situation is that you also need to raise your hand and say, I need some help.
Yeah.
And there's no shame in being, I'm really, really good at being a water operator and delivering clean water to the residents of XYZ town. There's no shame in saying, oh, by the way, I don't have any idea on how to do public affairs, right?
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's assuming that you do. The issue that you run into is that in a crisis, everybody's going to look at you and be like, okay, what do we do? And part of what you need to have prepared and the resources you need to have brought into your organization are the ones that can execute this. Again, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to raise your hand and say, I need some help.
Yeah. All right. Quick note on CUs. Thank you, Jared. CUs will be posted within 24 hours. Donnie is running a test today, and that's normally who we go through to get those up. I promised her I'd give her a 24-hour window to draft the 2 questions based on how this played out. It's going to be what you had to pay attention to, because you can't just go back and look at the slide for the answer. So thank you for joining with us. We will continue to work through these tech changes prior to our next webinar in September. Thank you again for joining us, and I will also I have a copy of Jared's presentation. I can PDF, and I'll put that underneath the link so you can download and see the slides that has those 10 steps as well, and we will try and get those to you as quickly as possible. Again, thank you all, and we will talk to you in September.